are so excited and honored to have our panelists here with us today, and I'll introduce them in turn. Leora Schertzer served as IJV's Campus Engagement Coordinator this summer, creating programming and resources to engage university students in Palestine solidarity. She is involved with solidarity organizing and leftist Jewish movements, working to foster cultural spaces that tap into our rich intellectual traditions and Jewish mysticism. Welcome, Leora. Rabbi Brant Rosen is an ordained Reconstructionist rabbi, and if I'm not mistaken, it's the 30th year of your rabbinate, Mazel Tov, and served congregations in his hometown of Los Angeles, Denver, and Chicago before co-founding Tzedek Chicago, which recently became America's first synagogue to officially designate as anti-Zionist. He is co-founder of the Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council, Tanait Tzedek Jewish Fast for Gaza, and is a published author, poet, and liturgist. Welcome, Rabbi Brant. Daniel Sarah Karasik is the author of the new poetry collection Plenitude, also Mazel Tov, and 5 previous books of drama, poetry, and fiction. Their work has been recognized with the Toronto Arts Foundation's Emerging Artist Award, the CBC Short Story Prize, and the Canadian Jewish Playwriting Award. They organize with Artists for Climate and Migrant Justice and Indigenous Sovereignty, and are the founding managing editor of Midnight Sun magazine. Welcome, Daniel Sarah. And finally, Dr. Diana Ralph, co-founder of IJV, now in its 14th year, and served as coordinator for its first 10 years. She is currently the learning coordinator at Or HaNeshama, Ottawa's Reconstructionist Synagogue, and co-organized the well-known and well-received Reconstructionist series, Expanding Conversations on Israel-Palestine. Dr. Ralph is also a retired associate professor of social work at Carleton University, therapist, and published author. Welcome, Diana. So without further ado, I'd love to jump right into the questions that we have for our panelists today. We've got 4 of them, and we'll start with our first, which is, how has your Judaism or spirituality shaped your activism, and vice versa? And maybe to kick us off, I'll invite Leora.
Sure, sounds good. Yeah, I would say that my moral and ethical principles are very much informed by my Jewish upbringing and Jewish education. Jewish spaces are some of the main contexts in my life where I'm asked to consider what is the right thing to do, what is good for society, and also like how can it be implemented and actualized. And my Jewish education taught me that when we make choices in our daily lives, we should take into consideration this basis of values that improves society and social welfare through action and through personal sacrifice, which, yeah, that's definitely central in, these are central currents in my activism. And then in terms of turning it the other way, how has activism shaped my Judaism? Speaking out against human rights abuses or whatever else it is that I'm advocating for, I find that it's very critical to have a reflection process about why I'm doing this work or what is compelling me to do this work. And Jewish ritual, I find, is a very helpful structure to reflect on the complexity of our world and our role within it. And I find on Jewish holidays and Shabbat, it's often one of my main focuses during these times to process and reflect on what my values are, what is important. So I feel like it's very cyclical, and Judaism informs both the action and the activism and the reflection and the processing.
Thank you. Rabbi Brant?
Thanks, Kevin. And thank you to IJV for inviting us. I'm really honored to be part of this conversation. It's a really interesting question. And as I thought about it, I'm not sure I'm able to really tease out what we call Jewish spirituality and Judaism and activism. It all, for me, it feels very mashed together. So I appreciate the question because it really caused me to discern, how this process unfolded. And I think for me, Judaism was always a part of my life. I grew up in a family that observed Judaism. We had to be home every Friday night for Shabbat. We're active in a Reform congregation in Los Angeles. And I also grew up in a family that was very committed to progressive politics and activism, and particularly my mother. And, so all of that was instilled in me and just sort of became part of my DNA, I think, from as far back as I can remember. And I think if I had to really tease out where my activism came from, I would say it's not so much Judaism, but the stories that I have come to embrace about Jewish historical memory, and just the historical Jewish experience throughout history. I have parents who were alive during the Holocaust. I'm still of that generation, and I was very struck by my mother in particular telling stories when she was a child, hearing about the Holocaust, and learning about her Judaism, all really at the same time, and the traumatic impact that had on her. And I think from that, I took that, Judaism, yes, has a historical experience of being victimized, but it also has a very powerful historical experience of resistance and of standing in solidarity with other oppressed peoples as well. And so all of that was part and parcel of my Jewish identity and how it was connected to activism. One final thing is, it struck me, I was thinking about this question yesterday. We have a weekly Torah study at my congregation. Every Shabbat morning, we read a section from the Torah portion, and we have a number of people who are not religious, who would describe themselves even as atheists, as radical atheists, but they come every week to Torah study. And there was a comment by one of the participants who was really struggling with the Torah portion, particularly the parts about going into Canaan and dispossessing the nations and occupying the land at God's command. And it seems like every week we read about this. And she described herself as a militant atheist. And this was a woman who was very active in the civil rights movement, by the way, as a leader, and was a freedom writer. And it struck me that she comes every week and wrestles with this text. And to me, that's where the word Jewish spirituality, I think, is very limited. I think we compartmentalize that, but I think to be a Jew means to wrestle with history, wrestle with the world as we have it, wrestle with the tradition that we've inherited. And I think whether we consider ourselves by a label of religious or spiritual or atheist, there's something very quintessentially Jewish about that.
Thank you. Diana. Oh, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Sorry about that. I really appreciate you saying that, Brant, about wrestling. I think my entire life has revolved around the struggle to reconcile Judaism with my activist commitments to promoting justice, especially around Israel-Palestine. In my life, I've gone from being secular and Zionist when I was young to being anti-Zionist and enthusiastically observant now. But for both, Judaism has been central for me. My parents struggled to reconcile Judaism with justice since before I was born. Like Brant, they were of the Holocaust generation. They had been raised Orthodox and Reform respectively, but they rejected observant Judaism and became very devout atheists. And they never told me why they made that decision, but I think they internalized anti-Semitic contempt for the old ways, and they were trying to assimilate, to fit in at a time when US Jews were struggling to be safe and recognized as white. They were very ambivalent about Jewish spirituality. Sometimes we'd celebrate Hanukkah, sometimes we'd decorate a Hanukkah bush with Christmas bulbs. My parents ridiculed their relatives who were religious but enjoyed attending seders that my aunt organized. On Yom Kippur, we sometimes fasted and had a day off school, but we didn't attend any services. We didn't learn Hebrew, and my brothers and I weren't bar bat mitzvahed. For a few years, we attended our Reform synagogue until my parents quit after a nasty fight with the board. And that was that for my religious training. But the one key aspect of Judaism that my parents retained was their unwavering commitment to social justice. And even though I'd never heard the words tikkun olam, they taught me that profound concept. My mother sang me to sleep to Joe Hill. I have a newspaper photo of my mother pushing me in a baby carriage on a demonstration to lower milk prices. And I often helped her stuff envelopes at her union office and marched on picket lines and sang in labor and protest songs. Activism became my life. In my teens, through the National Conference of Christians and Jews, I got active in the civil rights movement and then branched out to every other social justice issue. And I've devoted my life to social justice, environmental struggles, and basically ending capitalism. If anything, my parents' religion was Zionism, which just post-Holocaust, US lefty Jews like them saw as revolutionary. The implicit deal for post-Holocaust Jews was to replace their love of Judaism with love of Israel, a place where Jews would finally be safe. This is a signed copy of a book by I.F. Stone, the communist journalist, which celebrates the triumphant victory of Israel and the creation of Israel. As a teen, I used to pore over this book with its images of heroic images of the Haganah and the Irgun, Jewish fighters defeating evil Arabs and the British. And it concludes with this line, which I think exemplifies the spiritual link that they saw between Judaism and Zionism. It says, "From Israel and its people may again be learned the potency of faith." So here is a newspaper clipping of me at age 4 holding a JNF blue box while the US ambassador to Israel puts a quarter in it. I learned Israeli dances and I admired my cousin who joined the IDF, and I hoped to join an Israeli kibbutz when I grew up. But after the Six-Day War in 1967, when I was 21, I asked my father, a man who had helped to forge international law, a man I respected as committed to justice, why Israel wasn't giving back the West Bank to the Palestinians. He turned red with rage and he bellowed at me, "If you ever attack Israel again, I'll disown you." At that point, confused and ignorant, I gave up on even thinking about, much less doing anything about Israel. I had plenty of other social causes to occupy me. And as an assimilated, non-practicing Jew, I didn't have much to do with Israel. What I wanted to say, I don't want to take up too much time, but I just wanted to say that trying to ignore the occupation and the growing evidence of Israeli human rights abuses meant walling off myself and becoming more and more ashamed of being Jewish. So in 1992, when my non-Jewish girlfriend Jean mentioned something about Christmas, I mumbled embarrassedly, "Actually, I'm Jewish, but it's not important." And she wisely recognized that it was very important to me. And she gently encouraged me and accompanied me to attend a synagogue. It was terrifying for me. I was terrified that the Nazis would kill me if I went into that building. I know it was irrational. Or that the congregation would arise en masse and tell me to get out because I had abandoned Judaism. But of course, neither of those happened. Instead, I found I loved the music, the food, the discussion, the warmth of the congregation, and most of all, the ethical commitment to healing the world. And to her surprise, Jean loved it too. And she eventually converted, and we got married under chuppah, an event commemorated by my son's play, My Mother's Lesbian Jewish Wiccan Wedding. Judaism became a central, valued part of my life. I realized that by running from Jewish practice and identity, I had lost a precious part of myself, which I now joyfully re-owned. I attended synagogue regularly, studied everything I could lay my hands on about Judaism. I learned Hebrew, joined the choir, and chaired the Social Action Committee. But that forced me finally to face the contradictions between Zionist Judaism and my ethical commitment to justice. And I should probably shut up. I could go on long and hard about how tough it was, how apoplectic rabbis were when I tried to talk about it. and sobbing in the Shabbat service on February 26th in 1994, the day after Baruch Goldstein gunned down 29 Muslim worshippers at the Mosque of Abraham in Hebron on Ramadan. I just felt alone and defeated. So I quit first one and then another synagogue, but I didn't want to again give up on Judaism. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Diana. Daniel Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks for those really compelling accounts. I think I'm also in the, it's hard for me to tease apart my Judaism from the rest of my life, including my sort of activist commitments camp. But I was thinking, this isn't what I was going to say initially, but I was just thinking as we're talking, there's this line that's, sorry, is that, okay, no, there's like a buzzing at my window. It's like nature. I hope this isn't too loud for you. But there's a line that's associated with the Frankfurt School of psychoanalytic Marxists, and I think it originally is a line in Marx that's about the ruthless criticism of everything that exists, or the ruthless criticism of everything existing. And I think that sensibility is one that I associate with a certain current of Jewish thought, certainly of sort of Talmudic, sort of rabbinic or Talmudic inheritances, and the propensity to hold everything and anything up to the light of critical scrutiny, I think is what I understand as, I mean, obviously not an exclusively Jewish sensibility, but certainly a characteristically Jewish sensibility that I relate strongly to, and I think I relate much more strongly to that than to any kind of ethical exceptionalism or ethical or moral exceptionalism sort of attaching to Jewishness, because while I do feel that ethical precepts were sort of nurtured in me, as part of my sort of fairly traditional Jewish upbringing, I also find the sort of the logic of exceptionalism, that is also like so much of the animating logic of the Israeli state, is one that I always like sort of try to like catch in myself, because I feel like it's slippery. There's something complicated there for me. So I don't know. I think I sort of spent a long time not knowing how to relate to how to sort of connect my developing politics to my Judaism. I was deeply horrified by what I experienced of Palestinian oppression, sort of at firsthand when I was a teenager, in my travels as a teenager, and then I think I just kind of bracketed it in a sort of like I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do with it, so I just kind of like didn't do anything, and just like, and I think for many years my Judaism was humanistic. I was sort of interested in Jewishness as one expression of sort of spiritual hunger, or hunger for beauty and for goodness, but it was absolutely depoliticized. My politics were very assimilationist. I was, I think, just participating in, whatever kind of whiteness gave me access to fairly uncritically. And then it was only really many years after those initial sort of teenage encounters with the Israeli occupation that my politics sort of shifted. I mean, I sort of became connected to like socialist organizing sort of spaces. And I think it was really only when I was able to integrate, an understanding of capitalism and of settler colonialism, imperialism, and how those were all sort of showing up in the form of Israel, and how that, of course, was, how that Israel was such a presence in the ways that I'd been socialized as a Jewish person throughout my life. It was only then that I was really able, I think, to make those connections more fully. And it happened sort of socially. It happened because I met people who helped me do it. I was active in If Not Now, which is a group you might know of here in Toronto. And I mean, that was the first time where I was like, oh, I think I can be Jewish in a way that doesn't require me to bracket off like huge parts of myself or what I care about, or and yeah, so I think, and the other thing I wanted to say quickly is just that I think that, my Jewishness is also like I can go through the world trying to, assimilate, as much as I want. I mean, in terms of like trying to pass as a white Christian or trying to pass as many other things that I'm not. But the world doesn't treat me that way, right? Like that we sort of still experience, I am still, I still experience sort of oppression on the basis of my Jewishness in certain ways that are often pretty subtle. But, like so the experience of anti-Semitism, I think, in a sort of white Christian society, for me, can create a basis. It doesn't always. Sometimes it can create very like reactionary, conservative, responses or positions. But I think it can create a basis for solidarity with the many others who are hurt and harmed by white Christian society and by the white Christian supremacy.
Thank you. For our next question, I know that some of you have already touched on this, and so by all means, if there's something you'd like to add, or feel free to, feel free to set this question aside if you feel that you've already covered it. But the question was, when did you make a connection between your spiritual or religious and political identities? And Leora, maybe we'll start again with you.
Yeah, sounds good. I would say the like tipping point for me was actually at Jewish labor Zionist summer camp. I was quite involved with Habonim Dror, actually only a little bit later on, like when I graduated high school, but it was the first time that I was exposed to the leftist Jewish tradition pretty much at all. And yeah, in this summer camp, there was a very strong emphasis on living out values of social justice, socialism, sharing, and equality. But it was very, very focused on Israel. Even though the camp is Zionist, I would say that the emphasis on social justice or like these other kind of elements drew in a lot of anti-Zionists or non-Zionists, and the fostering of these progressive political discussions promoted a very active dialogue about Israel in general. I would say, I guess, it was a very, very intense environment where people were very, engaged and stimulated and like willing to hear each other out, or like very intellectually curious, and like Israel was kind of a central point of identity in this camp. And a lot of people very strongly agreed with it or disagreed with it, even though a lot of the people did disagree. I think just having the context where it was like where people were politically engaged was very informative in like basically engaging me with Israel at all, or considering the like political implications as Jewish people in in Israel. And then I would say a second tipping point for me, or like a connection period, was at university. Discussions about Israeli apartheid were very, very, very prominent on campus. And I felt like I was often called upon or questioned as a Jewish person to respond for my knowledge or my views. And in the past, I was maybe like, or in high school, I would have been more agnostic, or just like I was afraid to form opinions because I was always told or fed that it was very complicated. But I got to a place where that response didn't fly anymore, and I was feeling I was kind of stuck in a position where I had to decide on my relationship to Israel. And I also felt I was also seeing more the like the right-wing Jewish organizations and institutions on campus speaking out values that I did not align myself with at all. And I felt compelled to speak out against these institutions that claim to represent the Jewish community to justify Israeli human rights abuses. And then at that point, I got quite involved with, if not now, Montreal.
Beautiful, thank you. Daniel Sarah.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I accidentally sort of gave part of my sort of response to this question to the previous one. But I do, yeah, I would underline also that if not now was critical for me in making some of those connections, and letting me organize or organize or be with others sometimes in a way that maybe was not even quite organizing, like explicitly on the basis of my Jewishness. Like there was definitely a moment pre-pandemic, I would say, like, as I was most active in, if not now, sort of 2018, 2019, and then I haven't quite figured out how to sort of, well, I guess we're in changing times, but over the course of the pandemic, I found it difficult to figure out how to plug into that sort of work in a way that felt effective. But yeah, there was definitely a moment when I was like, I had been sort of in, pluralistic. I was actually brought into the Fight for 15 and Fairness movement, sort of the minimum wage movement for a living wage in Toronto here, by a friend who had been doing explicitly like faith group organizing, and he's Jewish and he's also doing rabbinical training right now, but he'd been doing sort of faith group organizing for the 15 and Fairness movements. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Like it's interesting to be able to sort of bring one's identity or one sort of like social world to other sort of struggles in a way that is not just simply an assertion of that identity or something, but that is also organizing from that sort of specificity and from those relationships and stuff. And I was pretty inspired. Shout out to Aaron Rotenberg for modeling that for me. But I think it was a bit it was a real sort of breakthrough, I think, in some ways, for me to kind of feel that, oh yeah, like maybe I can sort of try to organize my people. And who are my people? Well, maybe my people are like other sort of like left leaning or left wing Jews and like artists. I'm sort of embedded in those communities. So I think it was interesting to feel just like tactically or strategically, like you sort of ask yourself, like, where can I be most useful? Where can I be most effective? And I think often the answer is like, in my existing sort of relationships and networks of trust, or maybe not, trust is too strong a word in some cases, but, sort of like connectedness, and so that was sort of important for me. And I think otherwise, I would say that in general, my sort of analysis or my understanding of the kind of Judaism that I want to see in the world or that I want to live was really inseparable from broader sort of transformations in my politics and political education that I had the benefit of, like 5, 6, 7 years ago at this point. And that I think I read, I keep referring back to the sort of like, the kind of more classic like Marxist tradition, but there's a line in Trotsky now about, how like on the state of Israel, and he's writing, I guess, like in the 30s, I guess it must be, but he says there will never be any, Trotsky's Jewish, right? Trotsky's like born like Lev Bronstein, and he says there will never be safety for the Jewish people in the project of the state of Israel. The safety for the Jewish people, consists in world revolution and the sort of the overthrow of the capitalist system, in which Jewish people have been situated historically in all kinds of complicated ways that have very seldom been, durably good for the Jewish people, right? Like sort of an account of how Jews within capitalism have often been, and also pre-capitalism, have been granted precarious status at very best. And so, sort of making those connections, I think, helped me, maybe paradoxically, helped me figure out how to sort of actually be present politically in more specifically Jewish forms of struggle and anti-Zionist, anti-occupation struggle.
Thank you. Diana.
In 2001, I moved to Toronto, and that was the first time that I ever both met anti-Zionists and Palestinians. And that was big for me. And I began reading everything I could. And I remember Judith Weissman giving a speech saying Golda Meir was evil, and I'm going, what? And the Exodus was a myth, and it was, and then meeting Palestinians at Muslim Jewish dialogue groups and Muslims, and seeing the Islamophobia they experienced, but also their clarity about how incredibly oppressive the Israeli state is. So that's when I figured it out.
Thank you. Rabbi Brant?
Yes, boy, I have lots in common with all of our speakers. I started to make these connections, I think, in a deeper way when I was an undergraduate and really engaged in my own spiritual search. And it was a pretty wide spiritual search. I was dabbling in all kinds of religious and philosophical traditions. Not an unusual phenomenon at that age. And I kept coming back to Judaism. And I think it was really because I felt it was my tradition. I mean, it's as simple as that. I felt an ownership of this tradition, all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it, in ways that I didn't feel with other traditions. Just that didn't have that sense of grounding. And I think what Daniel said, quoting the Frankfurt School, I remember as I started to learn more about Jewish literature and doing Torah study, and in particular Talmud study, and the notion of question everything was very much sort of a central ethic that I identified in Judaism. That the culture of debate, the wrestling with tradition, as I said before, the struggle, that was something that was very appealing to me. And of course, it had political implications as well that I think I readily identified. Like Diana and Leora, I identified as a Zionist, as a progressive Zionist, and that was a really important part of my Jewish identity and my spiritual search as well. And like Diana's parents, I think I saw Zionism as a revolutionary movement. I definitely identified it that way. And I was also, like Leora, I was very influenced by labor Zionists. I lived in a co-op, a big house with a bunch of friends and kind of mentors, really, from Hashomer Hatzair, and they were spending their last year in the States before they moved to Israel to join a kibbutz. And that was incredibly impactful on me. And I ended up dropping out of school and going to Israel for 2 years, living on 2 different kibbutzim. And, I entertained all kinds of questions, about Israel and Zionism during this time. I mean, I think I located myself on the left edge of Zionists. And, I was a supporter of what was called the two-state solution back in the day, when that was considered a very radical and beyond the pale thing to be suggesting in the Jewish community, which is kind of astounding to even think about now. But I always entertain questions, which I can talk about a little bit later, about just the Zionist enterprise in general. And so when I was in Israel, though, was when I started to think about becoming a rabbi. I was, among other things, auditing classes at Hebrew College, the Reform Seminary in Jerusalem, and I was taking classes with first-year rabbinical students, and just the notion that, in addition to it being a profession, just the notion that I could spend my life continuing to work, the primary locus of my work would be the continuing this struggling, was very, very appealing to me. Although I swore I would never be a congregational rabbi. I thought congregations were just hopelessly middle class and places, I like to say, it's where comfortable Jews went to feel more comfortable. And I couldn't articulate what kind of a rabbi I wanted to be, but I definitely was not going to be a congregational rabbi. And then in the end, that's the only kind of rabbi I've ever been, but I'll save that for a future question too.
Thank you. So I'm just cognizant of the time and hoping that we can save just a few minutes at the end today for question and answers. So I think what might make most sense is to sort of try and wrap our third and fourth questions together into one and invite our panelists who've really been speaking so eloquently, and thank you again for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today. Invite them to speak to whichever part of the question they feel most resonates with them. So combining the two, what are some of the successes, challenges, and or hopes that you might have for engaging Jewish, religious, and spiritual communities? And maybe Rabbi Brant, we'll start with you.
Sure, so we'll combine the last two and then we'll go on to question and answer. Great. So yeah, I did become a congregational rabbi to pick up where I left off. And this was during a time where I was really starting to actively, or over time, I started to actively challenge many Zionist assumptions that were sort of a core of my Jewish identity. And you know, the final breaking point for me was, I can really pinpoint it as 2008, which was one of Israel's earlier assaults on Gaza at the time, and it was a time of great anguish for me. And up until that point, I had been spending more time in the West Bank. I had been meeting with Palestinians under occupation and learning more about the Palestinian resistance. And I couldn't remain silent anymore, and I really spoke out against Israeli oppression and apartheid, and identified myself as a Palestine solidarity activist and became more involved in Jewish Voice for Peace. And when I think about some of the successes, you might imagine my congregation. It was a Reconstructionist congregation in Evanston, where I continue to live. They, to their credit, they said, we really tried to make it work. Like, they understood I was doing this out of conscience, but they also understood that I really stepped on a third rail and we needed to figure this out. And we did. For a little less than 10 years, we found a way that I could speak my conscience, but also make it clear that I was my conscience and I was not speaking for my congregation, and that there was a variety of points of view in my congregation. And I would call that playing the inside game, trying to influence from within the established Jewish community to push on that envelope. And what happened was, and I consider that to be a great success even now. I took a delegation of congregants to the West Bank, which was still to this day one of the most proudest moments of my rabbinic career. I really took them we went into refugee camps, we met with Palestinian civil society, we didn't spend any time in 1948 Israel, and I wanted them to see it with their own eyes, and they did, and I know it transformed all of them. And I continued to push that envelope, but of course, I pushed until I found myself on the other side, and I had to leave the congregation because it was an unsustainable situation. So I found myself now on the outside, and I didn't know if I would work as a rabbi anymore. I didn't know if I could. I didn't know if there was a congregation that would hire me. Looking back, I guess what I started doing is playing the outside game and really trying to work with other like-minded Jews to create new Jewish community, alternative Jewish community to the establishment. And that I consider to be a great success as well. I mean, I think there's room for both, but I also think that ultimately they can't coexist. You can't be Zionist and anti-Zionist in the same community. It sounds almost, obvious to say, but these wide tent approaches to saying we're all inclusive, we take liberal Zionists, we take non-Zionists, we take anti-Zionists, I think is just, to put it politely, not a sustainable model. But I do have a great deal of hope in the growth of communities that identify with Jewish diaspora as opposed to Jewish political nationalism, that identify as anti-Zionist. And I see the beginning of support for these kinds of communities as well. And there's foundations like the Jewish Liberation Fund they're specifically trying to fund these kinds of communities. So I see that as a very important ray of hope for the future.
Thank you. Diana?
Thanks. Right. I so appreciate you, Brant, all of you. Well, I've had a lot of challenges, unlike anybody else here. And just to be brief, I started out by alienating all my friends by lecturing them with the facts, and that didn't work. And then as the adult education coordinator, I tried more gentle approaches, and I noticed Yael is on the call, and I'm so grateful. We brought in her very gentle 3-part film Palestine trilogy as a way of opening up the door for my congregation at the Reform Synagogue I was at. And people in the congregation grumbled about Palestinian propaganda. And one member quit in protest and withdrew her offer to donate $1 million for a new building, which put me in the doghouse. And it went downhill from there. On the 60th anniversary of Israel, some of the women at the temple were making 60 baby quilts for the mothers of Ashkelon. And I like quilting, so I joined them. And eventually I had this plan all along. And I said, why don't we make baby quilts for the infants in Gaza as a peace offering? And they angrily blew up and said, they're the enemy. And my rabbi was not sympathetic, and I was in tears, and I quit. So for 5 years, I mostly focused on founding and growing IJV, which I loved. But again, there was the opposite problem there, because the leaders in IJV at that time were almost all hostile to Jewish spirituality, and they were almost as hostile as the synagogues were to them. So to bridge that gap, Jean and I created a Palestine Solidarity Haggadah, and each year we welcomed IJV Ottawa members who loved they had no idea that you could have a great Seder without talking about race, racist stuff about Egypt and bad pharaohs and stuff. And I'm so pleased that IJV has moved beyond that this is happening, and that Rabbi Leora Pizarro is holding, is bringing spirituality into IJV. Anyway, the big deal was that in 2013, I joined Ohana Shema, which is the Ottawa Reconstructionist congregation, when it hired Rabbi Liz Bolton, who you probably know, Brant. And Liz was great, and she and I strategized about how we could pry open the door, because Ohana Shema, as a matter of principle of keeping the peace, just wouldn't talk about it. And together, we did a whole bunch of things. Liz did a Think and Listen, with her support, the board allowed me to put on 9 successful programs about Israel-Palestine that were more and more radical, I think, and they began to realize, oh, it's safe to at least talk about it. And then in 2017, Liz nominated me to join the Joint Israel Commission of the Reconstructionist movement. I was the sole Canadian and the most pro-Palestinian there. There were AIPAC members on it. It was purposely set up to span the spectrum. And like Brant says, the Reconstructionist movement's policy is firmly liberal Zionist, J Street, and they don't want to move. But they about a third of their members are JVP member people, and so they have to tolerate us. Anyway, my hope in joining it was to push the movement to challenge the two-state solution and to promote real discussion and policy changes around Israel-Palestine. And I've done it, as much as it will move. I think we got them to put out some progressive statements. We had papers and webinars on Israeli annexation. And I remember we met with Deborah Waxman, who's the head of the Reconstructionist movement. And she said, but what about the Green Line? And we were saying, Israel has never recognized the Green Line. Don't you know that? And they, we now, well, I've quit the JIC. I couldn't stand it after a while. But we did manage to have workshops on how to talk about Israel-Palestine in your congregations. And a lot of congregations wanted that. We did that at convention. And and we've developed some resources for them. Now that group is doing stuff on doing a whole thing on BDS, and the Reconstructionists have actually issued a statement saying we have to think about this apartheid stuff. So they're never, as far as I'm concerned, or at least never in the near future, going to move fast enough in my lifetime to step off the fence, because that's where their funding is. So instead, as you mentioned, a team of the 6 of us with Lori Zimmerman and Brian Walt and the other people on the JIC who had been working with, decided to put together this series called Expanding the Conversation. And we had over 1,100 participants from all over North America and also across the political spectrum, and of listening to 6 rabbis, including Brant. And I think it was powerful, and it also scared the shit out of the Reconstructionists and gave courage to the Rabbinical College that it's okay to talk about this stuff. So I'm really proud of that. And that's pretty much where I'm going on that.
Thank you. Daniel Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I'd echo, well, I don't know if this is a direct echo of what's been said, but I think I have struggled. I found it difficult to persuade and recruit those close to me who are committed to a sort of Zionist or a sort of what we might identify as a more conservative Jewish politics. But I've been very heartened by the ways that organizations like IJV and If Not Now have been able to sort of draw in questioning, left-moving, critical sort of people developing more critical consciousness around Palestine. And I think my optimism lies less in the possibility of sort of transforming, establishment institutions and more in the possibility of, I think, of the growth of a sort of like holistic left politics that includes, an adequate politics around Israel and Palestine, or Israel-Palestine, like that it's, that I think I feel that that those who disagree with us, like those who see the state of Israel in its sort of, like in its domination of Palestinian people as somehow like a necessary evil or not that bad or whatever, that is obviously connected to a much broader politics, that if you sort of scratch the surface of anybody sort of espousing those views, usually you will find fairly predictable sort of attachments to capitalism and to geopolitics more generally. I mean, obviously, like not always, like not across the board. There exists like anti-capitalist sort of pro-Israel politics and all sorts of, like there exists the labor, like the labor Zionist tradition as a whole. But often as I encounter, sort of Israel politics, like in my own family and networks and stuff, they're attached to a worldview, that's sort of and ultimately an understanding of the place of Jews in the world, a certain kinds of fear, an understanding of how we win safety, and so on. And I think that for me, that the Israel piece of that can't be sort of changed in isolation. I think that without sort of, in the absence of broader sort of movements and organizations that people can plug into that can sort of reflect, a more holistic left politics, I struggle to see how a sort of anti-Zionist politics can grow. But I do think that in building those sorts of organizations, I mean, there have been attempts made within the NDP, for example, to sort of integrate an anti-Zionist, a pro-BDS politics. And I think the NDP is a complicated vehicle for that sort of, those sorts of aspirations. The NDP is not a revolutionary party, to say the least. But I do think that sort of impulse to connect critical Palestine politics to other struggles, as IJV often so sort of visibly does, I think is the way forward that gives me some hope.
Thank you. And the last word goes to Leora.
I actually have a minor point of disagreement with Rabbi Brant. I feel like the Jewish left is already so fragmented, and there's many small differences in opinion among Jewish leftist movements today that end up being deal breakers for individuals looking to join these movements. Like, some are not anti-Zionist enough, some are too anti-Zionist, or people take issue with certain, I'm sorry, I'm getting a call from my grandpa. Okay, got it later. But yeah, I guess there's not the level of diversity in Judaism today that there maybe was before, not or like in terms of active and robust movements that are like resilient against backlash, I guess. And it's hard because people feel very strongly about their opinions on Israel-Palestine, and it is hard to find a middle ground. But I think in order to make things happen for ourselves, we sometimes have to accept our differences just so that we can have like a common space where we can come together at all. And I guess sorry, I'm only talking about challenges and less about hopes, but there is generally a dearth of spiritual engagement in our broad culture and society. So in a lot of my interactions with people, it seems like there's a serious appetite for this type of spiritual engagement, but because there's a lack of resources and a lack of examples for some people, they don't always know where to start or know how to engage with like an alternative Judaism. But yeah, I definitely feel a lot of hope with these types of movements like IJB to be a beacon and an example for people that are looking for something different.
Thank you. And I'll now turn it over to Tamara to close the set. Thank you all very, very much.
Yeah, thank you.